The title of this presentation is Free Trade and the Collapse of America, and it's the story of how the United States is being systematically driven into economic collapse. But fortunately, it's also the story of how we, the American people, can stand up for liberty and stand up for freedom worldwide. Before I begin this presentation, I want to take a second to introduce myself. My name is Larry Ballard. I'm a speaker and author of two books, Modern Slavery and the Fight for Freedom, and The Economic Tribulation, How to Survive and Prosper. Modern Slavery and the Fight for Freedom is the story of how the U.S. is being intentionally driven into economic collapse, but fortunately it also contains a complete political platform entitled the American Reformation Platform. The Economic Tribulation, How to Survive and Prosper is the study of the Great Depression, and it gives readers insights as to how to invest in a downturn economic environment. With a national debt of $14 trillion, not counting unfunded entitlements, it should be no surprise to anybody that the U.S. is headed down a slippery slope towards financial collapse. But hopefully during the course of this presentation, you'll gain understanding as to exactly what it is that's causing the financial collapse of the United States, and hopefully you'll choose to be a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem. My book, Modern Slavery, is set 20 years in the future, and it's a dialogue between myself and my grandson, Eric. In the opening of the book, my grandson asked me, "Grandpa, how is it possible that the United States, once the most economically powerful and once the freest nation in the world, is now basically a third world country, a part of a super capitalist communist dictatorship?" I replied and said, "Eric, do you remember the time we played Monopoly? On the first roll you landed on Park Place and bought it. On the second roll you landed on Chance, and it said advance token to Boardwalk. You bought that, you put hotels on both of them, and in short order you basically bankrupt all of us." That's the story of free trade. That's the story of how a group of nations got control of the world's wealth and have controlled and manipulated governments and the world economy ever since. There's a saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's the story of the free trade system. It had its inception in the colonial era when the monarchs of Europe, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Japan, and most importantly England, began to set sail around the world to gain control of the resources of the world. The most successful of all these monarchs was England. It's said that the sun never set on the empire of England, but I want to stress it was an evil empire because they traded in slaves, in opium, and they plundered nations for gold. I want to read you a quote from Henry Carey, the economic advisor of Abraham Lincoln, who was fully aware of just how evil this empire was. He says, and I quote, "It, the British system," referring to the free trade system, "is the most gigantic system of slavery the world has yet seen, and therefore it is that freedom gradually disappears from every country over which England, the free trade system, is able to obtain control." If we look at it from a modern perspective, all we have to do is insert the name China in place of Britain, and we have begin to have a basic understanding of what the free trade system is in our modern era. I can't overemphasize just how evil the free trade system is. From their inception, their goal was to get control of the world's natural resources, and to do so they traded in slaves and in opium and ravaged nations for gold, and literally drove nations around the world into the colonial empire, into a system of slavery. Today, we don't realize it, but they control us in much more subtle ways. They control the international banking network, and they control international corporations, and through the money that they've amassed, they control governments around the world. Hopefully, before this presentation is over, you will have a greater insight as to exactly how they control us, and more importantly, you'll have an understanding as to how we can fight back. I included this slide because I really want to drive home just how evil the free trade system is. This is a political cartoon from the colonial era. It's entitled The British Empire, the Opium War, China Corrupted by Force. It's the story of how the British, in order to control China, deliberately and intentionally drove the Chinese people into drug addiction by addicting them to opium. Now that you have a basic understanding of what the free trade system is and how it's set about to control the world's resources, now what we really need to understand is how the free trade system functions in a modern society, and in particular, how it has gained control of the economy of the United States and the governments around the world and is endeavoring to collapse the free market system in order to drive us into a one-world government. In order to understand this, we need to look at the inception of the Industrial Revolution. By the time the Industrial Revolution was getting started, the free trade system had morphed into an international banking consortium. And now, under the auspices of the Industrial Revolution, it was embarking to take control of all the major corporations of the world at their very inception. Individuals like J.P. Morgan literally bought into virtually every major corporation on Wall Street, and he had counterparts representing the financial elite who were likewise buying into corporations in other countries around the world. I want to give you a quote from Thomas Jefferson. Our founding fathers have been part of the free trade system, and they understood exactly how dangerous they were and what their objective was. I quote now Thomas Jefferson, "Banking institutions are more dangerous than standing armies. I believe that if the American people ever allowed private banks, the Fed, that happened in 1913, to control issuance of currency, which they do as of 1913, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of their property until the children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." Folks, that is exactly what is happening, and if we don't stop it before this collapse is done, the financial elite of the world will probably control upwards of 95% of all the natural resources of the world. The problem that Americans have in understanding the free trade system is that we look at things in terms of their immediate outcome, where the financial elite, whose goal it is to control the resources of the world, look at things in terms of decades. They have an objective to systematically, step-by-step control the resources of the world and drive us into a one-world government. And frankly, they don't care how long it takes as long as they achieve their goal. With that perspective in mind, I want to read you a quote from 1892 by William McKinley, and I think you'll see that they have systematically been achieving their goal. Free trade slaves down the workman's labor first, and then scales down his pay by rewarding him in worthless and depreciated state currency. So folks, ask yourself, over the last 50 years, effectively, haven't your salaries dropped? And go back to 1913 when the Federal Reserve was put into place. At that point in time, a dollar was a dollar. And now, as I record this in 2011, the U.S. dollar is now worth approximately 4 cents, and we are headed towards hyperinflation. So with that, that effectively means that our labor is now discounted because we are being paid in counterfeit money that is literally worthless. But looking at it from a different perspective, I also want to have you take personal responsibility. By buying free trade goods, our greed makes us complicit in the very system of slavery which we need to be fighting. So we need to boycott free trade goods from China, because what we need to understand is that ultimately, once they morph into a one-world government, we, the people of the United States, will be no different than the slave laborers in China. I've been to China. I've seen the sweatshops, and I understand just how desperate those people are, sitting over there tied to their sewing machines or whatever it is they're manufacturing and making just a subsistence living. That is where we're headed, folks. We need to stop now. Stop participating in the free trade system. Vote no with your wallets. In the next few slides, I'll explain exactly how the free trade system is gaining control of the U.S. economy and systematically driving it into economic collapse. But for right now, I want to focus on the words of Henry Kissinger and what I consider to be a threat. He says, and quote, "The New World Order cannot happen without U.S. participation. As we are the most significant single component, yes, there will be a New World Order, and it will force the United States to change its perceptions." What Mr. Kissinger is talking about here is something called U.S. exceptionalism. And what that is the opinion that the United States has too much power, too much influence, controls too many resources, and needs to be economically collapsed so that it can be driven into the New World Order, where our economy will be leveled out with that of third world nations, and the United States will lose its control over geopolitical affairs. We can stop that from happening, folks. We are the linchpin for freedom for the entire world. If the people of the United States of America will stand up, will defy their government, and will defy the New World Order, we can yet resist being forced into the New World Order and being driven into a situation where we will effectively be a third world country and we will have lost our rights. As I've said repeatedly, it is no accident that the U.S. is being driven into economic collapse. I'm old enough to remember the historic day in which Richard Nixon announced that the U.S. was going to enter trade negotiations with China. Nixon didn't complete those negotiations because he was impeached and driven out of office, so it fell to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was given the assignment by his handlers to drive the U.S. into economic collapse by transferring the trade power of the United States to China. At that time, 1977, the U.S. was over 200 years old and had a scant $660 billion national debt. Now, in 2011, under the Obama administration, we have a $14 trillion debt, and that doesn't include unfunded entitlements. The question is, how in the world did the United States get in such debt in just 34 years? The answer is free trade. Again, I quote from Henry Kissinger, NAFTA is a major stepping stone towards the New World Order. So folks, as much as I hate to sound conspiratorial, I will develop a case that shows that the collapse of the United States economically is not by accident, is an intentional collapse that is being driven by the financial elite, and it is being done primarily through free trade agreements with China. In the last slide, I said that I believe that Jimmy Carter was given an assignment by his handlers to drive the United States into economic collapse, ostensibly through entering into free trade agreements with China. I'm not the only person who holds this opinion. I quote now from Congressman Duncan Hunter, 2006, "We practice what I call losing trade, deliberately losing trade over the last 50 years. Okay, what's he referring to? He's referring to the following, that of 128 major industrialized nations, the U.S. is the only one